All right, let's continue and begin the book of Judges. We are getting near the finish line, everyone. Let me remind you that after this week we have Thanksgiving break, Yera. Then we come back for that famous half week that leads us to our last session. Our last class period will be that Monday, and then Wednesday's the last day of the semester that week. Isn't it crazy? It always catches up on us quick. And then Thursday's a study day, and then we start into final exams. So I'll be working on a study guide for everyone, and hopefully have that to you all soon. I hate to start talking about things that we have to do at the end of the semester. But keep up on those group discussions. Keep those going strong, and your reading quizzes. We'll get to the end, and you'll have your points bucket amply full of lots and lots of points for the final grade and all of that. All right. Let's take a look at the book of Judges. What we have in the book of Judges is a historical and theological. It's a great example of historiography. We learned about that word when we had OT1, but this idea of the combination of history and theology. Of course, Joshua is the same way, but this is the time of coming out of the time of the conquest, and what we'll look at now is a time that's going to go all the way out to the establishment of Israel's first king. This whole period is commonly called to as the kind of the settlement period. Now that they've conquered the land, now it's time to have church. We got our building built, now let's get to the business of being God's covenant people. What's interesting about the book of Judges is that we have the author. We don't know who it is. Don't have to. He's a historian, theologian, and he gives us his thesis statement right at the end of the book. Let's take a look at the very last chapter in Judges. And he repeats this thesis statement in full and partial format at several other places in the book. The very last verse: in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The whole book of Judges is an amplification of that last phrase. Everybody was doing whatever was right in his own eyes. And it's one story after another story after another story. So here is a historian, theologian, writing history in such a way that it's conveying significant theological emphasis to his particular audience. And it's emphatic. We're going to get into this book and see it is a dark book. It's darkly written. And it's going to talk about, here's our deep thought picture. He's going to introduce seven cycles. That's the emphasis of the cycles. 7 cycles. There's the number 7. And it's about 7 so-called judges. The judges are the ones who are the primary actors in the book. And it's going to illustrate, again, approximately 400 scholars debate, but approximately 400-year period of one account after another account after another account of that very thing. Everybody's doing what was right in his own eyes. Now we'll talk about the first part of that phrase, that thesis statement, the idea or the impact of there was no king. And I have a little spin on that I'd like to introduce to you that a little bit later. But we have to allow the author to be selective. Certainly in a 400-year period, there's a lot to write about. He's picking certain accounts to include in his history. He is theologically motivated. He has his reasons for doing this. He has a particular message to convey to his audience. And it looks like it's not going to be very good in terms of, here's an illustration of what not to do. Don't be the person doing what was right in his own eyes, because this is what happens. We're going to see how this plays out. Now, the idea of the judge comes from the Hebrew word shafat, which is the idea of to judge. But what we really have functionally going on in the book, these individuals who are identified as judges really are functioning more as military deliverers. There's going to be conflicts along the way. As we'll see, there's part of the cycles. There's certain repeated activities that go on. God's going to raise up these so-called judges, but they'll function as military deliverers because there's going to be an opponent. There's going to be a skirmish. Battles are going to be ongoing, will be ongoingly fought over the promised land. But one interesting way to think about this idea of judge, a judge is someone who's identified as one who delivers judgment. Now we know that judgment can be, if it's from the divine hand, can be an intentional judgment. We've seen this. So as an extension of the divine hand, what we'll see with these judges at times is that they're delivering judgment, ongoing judgment against the pagan nations that are in the promised land. That's another interesting creative way of thinking about their role as judge. Judge for the divine court, you might say. How's that? And in terms of judgment, it's delivered in the package of a battle that's lost. All right? Defeat on the battlefield. All right. Okay, 7 cycles that repeat throughout the book. Now, they're not going to be linear. So this idea of one account, one judge, now there's going to be another story here and another story. So this linear idea, it's not the best way to think about the book in terms of these repeated cycles. So I've got this diagram that I specially designed just for this class. This idea of the repeated cycle, kind of like a wheel that's turning. You know, we just kind of go around and then we repeat, start over again, repeat, start over again. Really what we need to think about is starting from a certain, height, but eventually each cycle gets a little more raw, a little more edgy, a little more dark, and we're going to go down, kind of a downward spiral is what we really have. So what we have during this period is kind of in terms of the idea that there's no king. Instead, and you read about this in your textbook, this idea of this, you might think of this confederacy idea. A confederacy or a loose cooperation amongst the 12 tribes who have settled now in the land. There's no king, but they have representatives from the tribes that meet to discuss and share and keep the peace, so to speak, and hopefully cooperate. Let's take a look at chapter 2. We're going to see what are the aspects of the cycle, the cycle that's repeated. And let's have Uluwagbenga. Could I have you read, please, beginning in chapter 2, beginning on verse 11. I'm going to have you read a lot of text here. I'm sorry, sir. Starting in verse 11, the whole cycle goes all the way down to verse 23. So if you get tired in the middle of reading, you can have someone around you read in your place if you want to.
And the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and served the Baals, and they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They went after other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he gave them over to plunderers, who plundered them, and he sold them into the hand of their surrounding enemies, so that they could no longer withstand their enemies. Whenever they marched out, the hand of the Lord was against them for harm, as the Lord had warned. And the Lord had sworn to them, and they were in terrible distress. Then the Lord raised up judges, who saved them out of the hand of those who plundered them. Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they poured after other gods, and bowed down to them. They soon turned aside from the way in which their fathers had walked, who had obeyed the commandments of the Lord, and they did not do so. Whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge, and he saved them from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. The Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who afflicted and oppressed them. But whenever the judge died, they turned back and were more corrupt than their fathers, going after other gods, serving them and bowing down to them. They did not drop any of their practices or their stubborn ways.
Okay, we can pause there. So you see this cycle that's now starting to repeat itself. So the cycle has various components. One of the things I want to point out, the idea of the downward sense of this repeated cycle from judge to judge to judge, you see in verse 19. And then they acted more corruptly. So from generation to generation, this thing continues to get more severe in terms of the rebellion and the stubbornness of their ways. But see here a balance of judgment and grace. This is God at work, right? This is this thing that God is allowing the presence of these unconquered nations becomes then a tool, a divine tool by which God uses to refine or test. Refine, that's that refining of gold idea that we've talked about before. And that's what's going on here through this period. The different components are, I kind of summarize them here. There's this forsaking of the Yahweh. We need to remind ourselves that but Moses warned against this idea of forgetting the Lord by forsaking him and going after other gods. Now we're starting to see that start to creep in Israel's faith life. That leads to the anger of Yahweh. His nose catches fire in the Hebrew. Then there's this oppression or distress, this allowing them to experience the pain, experience the heat, you might say, of the oppressors. And then Yahweh will raise up a judge or a military deliverer. And then there's going to be a period of military peace. There's going to be the victory and a time of rest for God's people until they decide themselves to act more corruptly than they did before. So this is going to be that's why I have the illustration there of a whirlpool, kind of a downward spiral that we have for God's people. So, and in chapter, where are we? Chapter 2. Let's move back to chapter 1 and remind ourselves. What we have in that chapter, in chapter 2 that we just looked at, is kind of a theological summation of all of the cycles that he's going to start filling out with color throughout the rest of the book. So it's just a lot of the things that we'll see line up with what we just read and kind of did an analysis of there in chapter 2, verse 11 down through 23. But if we move back a little bit, let's move back to chapter 1. Remember, we saw in chapter 1 the unconquered nations, and you see them listed there in chapter 1, 27 down through 36. And that lines up with what we saw back in the book of Joshua. So these unconquered nations. And remember, the divine response to the reality of these unconquered nations in chapter 2, we see in verses 1 through 5. Remember, we read that section when I was making the connection from Judges to the reality of this in Joshua. And then we see the account of Joshua's death. Now, the astute student might say, well, what a minute. We have Joshua dying twice. You know, he's referred to as dying in chapter 1, verse 1, right? Now he's dying again. Well, there's not an exact timeline necessarily, sequentially, that's going on here, obviously. There's a blanket statement that's given in the very first verse of the book that kind of is attributed to the whole book, and then we kind of pericope in, and we have kind of an aligning, a selectivity activity going on with the author. I think it's theologically driven. Here's why. He wants us to be, in some ways, painfully aware of the fact that Joshua receives the divine rebuke in chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. He's part of the divine rebuke that's delivered. In other words, he's not off the hook before he dies. You know, he dies after receiving that. All him and all the people hear from the Lord with regards to the implications and consequences of the unconquered nation that they've left. So I think that might be what's going on. But anyway, so you cannot put the ancient author here, historian, theologian, under a tightly rigid control of precision with regards to his timeline. So we don't come to the conclusion that Joshua dies twice. All right. Judges will also remind us of God's grace. Yes, even in this dark book, there's going to be examples of God's grace. I like this picture because it kind of shows in the midst of the chaos, right? The tornado and the storm, God's grace will show up. So Judges chapter 1, let's see here. All right, let's look at, let's see, I think I'm overlapping here. Chapter 2, yeah, over in 20. Let's pick up in chapter 2, verse 20. So the divine response to the situation in terms of what happens here in terms of these repeated cycles. So the nose of the Lord starts to burn, or this idea of being angry against Israel. And he says, because this nation has transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and has not listened to my voice. That idea of listening there is that word Shema, the idea of hear. Remember the Shema passage that we looked at from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4? Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. So now we're moving away from this call to the singularity of one's allegiance. If there's one God that calls for, you might say, I erased it, but the one heart with feet idea. So verse 21, I also will no longer drive out them before any, I also will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died. In order to, and here's the idea, test, there's the language of refinement, refine or test Israel by means of them, whether they will keep the way of the Lord to walk in it as their fathers did or not. That's the fork in the road. Hey, if you go down this path, God's grace allows you to turn around 180 degrees and walk back foot by foot, step by step. In other words, the full distance in which it took you to get down there. If you go way down that path, you got to walk back the same way that you got there. And when you get to the fork in the road, now there's the path of obedience. That seems to be the way that the Lord works. So the Lord allowed those nations to remain, not driving them out quickly, as he did not give them into the hand of Joshua. So there's a little bit of a reminder of what we looked at when, remember, Moses evaluates the wilderness experience for Israel? Remember the generation that comes out of the 40 years in the wilderness? And, we see a similar kind of approach, a divine approach. What does God do? And what does Moses tell God's people when they come out of the wilderness and they're on the plains of Moab and they look around and say, why did this all just happen to us? Moses gives them the theology. You remember he says, you shall remember in chapter 8, verse 2 in Deuteronomy, you shall remember all the way which the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness these 40 years. Underline led. Every day camp was set up, pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night. God's presence never left them in the wilderness. They still had to walk through the wilderness. A lot of camping going on. I'm a Boy Scout. By history, my son was an Eagle Scout, and I was an Eagle Scout, and I have a long history with Boy Scouts. A lot of setting up of tents. I can identify with that. You have to have a proper functioning tent when you're camping. Otherwise, water and bugs and sometimes bears try to get in, right? So you need a functioning, well, anyway, that's another story. But notice this, that he might that he might humble you. There's our word again, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. So that's the same fork in the road now that we have it's the author of Judges now. I think he has his theology of Moses down pat pretty well. He's bringing the same kind of experience now into the present situation, and he's evaluating this period of history in similar ways that Moses evaluated that 40 years in the wilderness. I just want to make that connection for you. And it wasn't easy. He humbled you. He let you be hungry. But he fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you understand that Man doesn't live by bread alone, but man lives by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. That's what the lesson was about. So, your clothing didn't wear out. Your clothing did not wear out on you, nor did your feet didn't swell these 40 years. Thus you are to know in your heart that the Lord your God was disciplining you as father disciplines his son. Good parenting. We've talked about this before, right? So now we've got another situation where we're expecting some divine response to this rebellion, and we're going to see it in these repeated cycles. But on the foundation, again, on grace. I don't know, I come back to this. I could give you illustrations in my own life. I've talked about the time that I got fired from ministry. Yeah, I've shared that before. But the picture that I draw is, we have to understand whether we're evaluating our own situation or we're trying to help someone else in our ministry context, people that find themselves at the bottom of the hole oftentimes are crying out like the Israelites in the book of Judges. And it may be that they've gone down a wrong path, right? They've taken a nice little detour, and you might be the one to help them realize that there's a fork in the road and they took a wrong path. So the choices that they've led, one shovel scoop at a time, right, the dirt that's been removed, they end up in the bottom of a hole. And you are the counselor. God's maybe brought you into the path of this person. You're at the top yelling down, hey, let me help you get up out of the hole. Here's a shovel. And they may have to fill in the hole themselves. That's partially what God may do to help this person. But there's lessons that have to be learned for me. In my path, it was coming under authority, recognizing that I'm not a lone ranger minister, youth pastor. I have to appreciate and value the oversight of those above me in the authority structure. And once I figured that out through pain, one shovel scoop at a time, I was able to get myself back up out of that hole. And for some crazy reason, I end up doing the very thing that burned my britches in ministry. That's administration. I had to learn that being an administrator is all about knowing the authority structure and where you fit in and how the thing operates. This huge ship called Southwestern, or it might be a church that you're serving. Fitting in and understanding and how to serve and how to make your boss look good and all of those, which is making the Lord look good, ultimately. Those are some of the lessons that those of us in ministry have to learn sometimes. But sometimes the Lord will allow us to have our britches burned. It's ministry. We find that while we're ministering to others, the Lord is very actively ministering to us as well. So let's get into some of the early cycles here in the book of Judges. So we'll have 6 cycles, major cycles, and 1 minor cycle if you count Shamgar, the Conan the Barbarian of the Old Testament. Othniel to Samson, we'll look at these cycles. And a few other accounts at the very end of the book of Judges. The very first cycle is in chapter 3. And let's see, who can I pick on now? Let's see. See, Alex, where are you? Are you here? Did you leave early? I thought he was here. Deanie, I haven't asked you to read yet. Sorry. I'm not picking on you, though. But chapter 3, let's take a look at the Othniel cycle in chapter 3, verses 9 through 14. It's short, so that's good.
The Israelites cried out to the Lord. So the Lord raised up Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's youngest brother, as a deliverer to save the Israelites. The Spirit of the Lord came on him, and he judged Israel. Othniel went out to battle, and the Lord handed over King
Cushan Rishathaim
of Aram to him, so that Othniel overpowered him. Then the land had peace for 40 years, and Othniel, son of Kenaz, died.
Oh yeah, all the way down to 14, the whole cycle.
The Israelites again did what was evil in the Lord's sight. He gave King Eglon of Moab power over Israel because they had done what was evil in the Lord's sight.
Oh, wait a minute. Where?
Am I reading wrong?
You're reading what was asked.
Oh, thanks for that, Adam. You're fired again. I didn't want you to. I didn't want you to jump ahead to Ehud yet. So, yeah, okay, you finish that. Okay, you're good. Okay. All right, you're good. So they're serving Eglon, king of Moab. It's been a long day. All right, so Othniel, here we have the first judge, Othniel, and you read that extremely well. Thank you very much. And that's the kind of cycle that we would hope for. It's a plain cycle, and Israel starts well. So there's you see the Spirit of the Lord coming upon the judge. The Spirit of the Lord is active in this time to come upon one for a particular function or role. It's going to have a start and stop time. You don't think of it as, in terms of the activity of the Holy Spirit necessarily, like we have the Holy Spirit active in our lives. It's a different, God's coming upon for a purpose. And these judges are raised up to combat against the oppressor and relieve God's people for a time. So now, that's chapter 3, verses 9 through 14. Othniel will act as a military leader against the king of Aram. Now, in chapter 3, let's look at the transition. We see a transition quickly to the next judge. Verse 15. But when the sons of Israel cried to the Lord, you see the cycle repeating now, the Lord raised up another deliverer for them, Ehud, the son of Gera the Benjamite, a left-handed man. And the sons of Israel sent tribute by him to Eglon, king of Moab. Now, this particular cycle is interesting because it shows us the particular uniquenesses of this particular author of the Old Testament. There is humor in the Old Testament. There is exaggeration. There's irony. And all of these elements are brought into the recasting of some of these accounts. We're being told a historical account of something that happened, individuals, and sometimes we're told in a very humorous way, sometimes in a very ironic way. And the writing is intentional because it's meant to be edgy, sometimes humorous, to get the attention and to illustrate the point that the author's trying to make. So this is an interesting account. So let's take a look at this account of Eglon. Being a left-handed man, being that he was a lefty, he's not trained in using a sword with a strong right arm. So he's not really a real soldier. He's sent to King Eglon, king of Moab, and the text describes him down here in verse 17. Well, what Ehud does, he makes himself a sword which has two edges in verse 16, a cubit in length. He bounds it on his right thigh, of course, because he's left-handed, under his cloak. Of course, the irony here, as you know, that's his gift. That's the tribute. He presents the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab, as he presented the tribute to King Eglon of Moab. Now, the detail is Eglon was a very fat man. This is adding detail to the account. And it came about when he had finished presenting the tribute that he sent away the people who had carried the tribute. But he himself turned back from the idols which were at Gilgal and said, this is Ehud, I have a secret message for you, O king. What's the secret message? Everybody says. And he said, keep silence. All the attendants who were with him left. So it's just Ehud and Eglon. So Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber. Details here we don't want to overlook. What's going on here, and where's this fat king sitting? On his throne. Humor, ha. He's on the roof because that, in those days, if you were putting your outhouse in the house, you wouldn't put it in the house. You'd want to put it somewhere where the wind would catch the smell and carry it away. So he's sitting on the in his outhouse on the roof of his chambers. And Ehud says, I have a message from God for you. And he arose from his seat. It's kind of humorous. And Ehud, as a result, stretched out his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, details we've already been introduced to, and thrust it into his belly. That's enough. That's all I need to know. No, the author goes on. The handle also went in after the blade. And because he's a fat man, the fat crossed over the blade, for he did not draw the sword out of his belly. And then, because he's sitting on the cool roof chamber, the refuse comes out. This is gross, isn't it? Does it shock you, these kinds of details? And when we throw this at our, I have to say this because I teach children's church, but the Sunday school curriculum comes our way that brings these accounts in and presents them to the children, sometimes leave out these gory details, just so you know. But this is for adults, I guess. And this is a very, maybe there's exaggeration, and it's almost like reading a comic book. We read this account, and it's shocking and it's helping us to understand this is an intentional use of irony and humor by the author here. Ehud, as a result of this, will rally the troops, like the judges that are raised up by God, and he'll eventually win the day. And again, a judge is raised up by God to deliver judgment against, in this case, the Moabites. And we move on to the next judge. So that's the famous Shamgar, verse 31. And after him, Shamgar, the son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. That's an ox goad right there. I try to get it in this picture here. I think it's a long stick with a sharp end attached to it. And again, the only thing that we really have for Shamgar is that he strikes down a lot of Philistines on the battlefield, and as a result, like judges before, bring about judgment against an enemy. In this case, is the Philistines. Remember, the Philistines were one of those green territories, the unconquered part of the Promised Land. So this is, again, a reminder that the function of the judge and what's going on here. All right, let's move on to the next of the judges' accounts. In chapter 4, we're going to spend a little time with this one. Am I too old to be the only one in the room who knows who this couple is? Sonny and Cher, yeah. Some of you youngins don't even know who this couple is. I mean, I grew up watching Sonny and Cher on like one of those Sunday evening shows. She's still around, yeah. Yeah. I don't know what happened to Sonny. What happened? Is he? Why? So I forgot about that. I think you're right. Yeah, I know you're right. So we have. My point here is. Sorry that you don't know who Sonny and Cher is. You need to do some research on that. So Google that and find out about them. Some famous songs that they wrote. But this is Deborah and Barak. So I call them the Sonny and Cher of the Old Testament. So what we have here, let's look at this account. And in chapter 4, the Canaanite king Jabin and his military commander Sisera will rally against Israel. So now we have another oppressor rises up against Israel. Israel will cry out for help. So we see some of these elements of the repeated cycle start dropping in. Verse 3. And the sons of Israel cried to the Lord, for he had 900, that is, Jabin, he had 900 iron chariots. And he oppressed the sons of Israel severely for 20 years. All right, so that's the problem that needs to be solved. All right, so the Lord needs a military judge or deliverer to raise up, and he finds Barak. The only problem is there's something wrong with this picture. Let's take a look at some of the details, beginning in verse 4. Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lipidoth, was judging Israel at that time. So if you think of the idea of the role of judge, she's probably the only one who really fits the picture of sitting as kind of some wise counsel, people coming to her, asking for decisions to be made in terms of, do I go this way, or is this right, or is this right? So apparently she's part of a group, or maybe acting individually, so that she's actually judging or rendering decisions and helping people figure things out. Now verse 5. And she used to sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the sons of Israel came up to her for judgment. There we go. That's the role of the judge. Now she sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kiddush Naphtali, and said to him, Behold, the Lord, the God of Israel, has commanded, go and march to Mount Tabor. Take with you 10,000 men from the sons of Naphtali and from the sons of Zebulun. And I will draw out to you Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his many troops to the river Kishon, and I will give him into your hand. And Barak says in response, yes, what you have said is true. I know it to be true that if I lead the troops on the battlefield today, victory will be ours. As it has been in the past, so it will be now. Wait a minute, I read wrong. Barak says to her, if you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. Sorry, is that upsetting? He's being a little bit of a wimp. So here we have another attempt by the author to put a little edginess, right, to his recounting of this thing that happens in history. Here we have a world turned upside down. We're going to start to see that the world in this time in Israel's salvation history things happen in the opposite way, really, that they should. And here we have men acting like women and women acting like men in the military sense here. Who's the one who has the military shoes on in this particular situation? It's not Barak. Deborah is going to offer the right theology for the day, on the day of the battle. And we see that in verse 14. Let's move over there. And Deborah says to Barak, well, actually, I don't know if I was quite done there. Well, she says, well, I'll surely go in verse 9. I'll go with you. Nevertheless, the honor shall not be yours on the journey that you are about to take, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hands of a woman. Again, it's a world turned upside down. Men are to receive the honor, you might say the glory on the battlefield for a victory. Not the women. They're not the ones wielding the swords. There's irony here that's about just around the corner. We'll get to that punchline here in a little bit. But verse 14, Deborah says to Barak, arise for the day, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. He needs to be reminded, behold, the Lord has gone out before you. So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. And finally, he routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army with the edge of the sword before Barak. And Sisera alighted from his chariot and fled away on foot. So Sisera will flee the battlefield and he'll meet his fate. Verse 17. Let's see here. Back to you, Ben. Could I have you read verse 17 down through verse 21?
Meanwhile, Sisera had fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because there was peace between Jabin, king of Hazor, and the family of Heber the Kenite. Jael went out to greet Sisera and said to him, come in.
Wait a minute. You got to be a little more dramatic here. Could you be a little bit more feminine?
I'll try.
Feminine. This is a female.
So he went into her tent, and she covered him with a rug. He said to her, please.
I would be a little wimpy here with this voice.
Please give me a little water. She opened a container of milk and gave him a drink and covered him again.
Wait a minute. He asks for water, she gives him milk. See, there's details here that we, don't want to lose. I don't know how to make a big deal about this, but what's really good for quenching a thirst? Water, not milk. Milk leaves you a little. You got to drink more milk. You just never quench your thirst when you're given milk. Just kind of a little bit ironic. She's not giving him what he wants and what he asks for, and he says to her, please stand in the doorway of the tent, and it shall be if anyone comes and inquires of you and says, if anyone hear you, shall say no. But Jael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg and seized a hammer in her hand and went secretly to him and drove the peg into his temple. And it went, too many details, and it went through into the ground, for he was sound asleep and exhausted, so he died. There's details there. It's grabs you. It's horrific, but it's there. It's in God's word. The author here is obviously operating to bring about this part of history, but he's got theological intentions here going on. And this is a world turned upside down. It's dark, it's edgy, but that's the point. The author is trying to get our attention. And there was no king in Israel. Here's another example of people doing what was right in their own eyes. Maybe by now, as we're reading this historical account, we're trying to get our brain around the theological thesis statement of the author. Well, if a king comes on this scenario, or in this situation, if a king comes in, would this situation never happen? Would these kinds of things not happen if we have a king? And one of the things we have to ask ourselves, could it get any worse? All right, well, let's pick up the story of Gideon. Let's take a 5-minute break. Come back at the top of the hour.